you can't. So again, my name is Chloe. I'm a developer evangelist at CodeFresh, and the intention of what I want to show you in this talk is to give you a new perception of how to view the staging environment. So for quite some time, we've been implementing CI/CD using a staging server, and the staging server has served as a very meaningful part of our pipelines. But what I'd like to show you today is that given the latest technologies, we can actually rethink our pipeline, and we can rethink the way that we implement continuous integration and continuous delivery. And in fact, make that a lot more faster and streamlined. So before we dive in, a little bit about me. So my name is Chloe. I live in the Bay Area, and I help organize the Containers 101 group on Meetup, which I highly encourage you to join if you're in the area. I'm a developer as well as an advocate and a mentor for women in tech. I'm the developer evangelist at CodeFresh, and I'm a blogger of all things container, Docker, and diversity related. So a little bit about CodeFresh. We're a Docker native CI/CD, and we're a platform that automates the process of building, testing, and deploying containers. And it's built with Docker users in mind, since we've seen the way that containers have disrupted the way that we build and deploy applications. So here's our mini agenda for today. So first we'll be talking about common CI/CD implementations and the challenges that we run into with those common implementations. Then we will finally chat about containers and their impact on traditional CI/CD. So I'm sure most of you have seen a Git flow before, so I don't need to go into much detail here. But the main thing I want to highlight in these slides is that many of you have probably implemented CI slightly different. So I won't have a conversation preaching what this should look like, but I want to show this main model of Git flow. A real quick rundown of Git flow: we have the branch master, which is what we have in production. We have the staging and development branch, which is what we have in staging. And whenever a developer gets a task assigned to him or her, they're branching out of the develop branch. So they're working on a feature branch, and at some point they'll make a pull request, and the pull request, if approved, will merge back into staging, which eventually will be merged back into master production. So if we look at the set of activities at each point of time, we are writing our code and working on the feature branch. And it's likely that we also, if we're covering our bases, we're writing unit tests. So as good practice, we write our unit tests, we see our unit tests have passed, and then we have good coverage. So eventually when we make a pull request, we see the code and the code changes have been covered. But we also have peer review and testing in our code. So the point being that when it hits staging, the traditional way of continuous integration, it's hitting a much broader set of tests. And that's where we start running not only unit tests, but integration tests, UI tests, using Selenium, performance tests, and in some cases, manual tests to our code as well. So now if we look at this slightly different timeline, you'll see we're working on our feature branch and making a pull request, but we're doing that at staging. And that's where most of the heavy lifting tests are actually taking place. And on this timeline, you'll also see on the very bottom here where it says cost, that's the most costly for us to fix these issues. So if we find issues while we're working on our feature branch, it's much easier to incorporate these changes to make the fixes. And later when we find the issue, it's a lot more expensive and a lot more costly. So the longer we wait, the more costly it is. So another aspect of the traditional way that we develop and implement with continuous integration is the handshake that we have between development and deployment. And a typical handshake will be a label or a stamp in the code base, the test report, the test results, sometimes some proposed changes in the database, and a list of any of the known issues, and communicating this as part of the release notes. So what are the challenges? So we've touched on a few, but I will review a couple that we usually see. So firstly, we're all familiar with someone breaking the staging environment scenario. Usually it holds us all back, and we have to wait until it gets fixed. And this is really frustrating to the whole team, but even more so to the developers who, and in this case, the ones who made that change and broke the staging environment for everyone else. And that's likely to happen when we implement a process in which our code changes are being tested for UI and integration at the staging environment for the very first time. So in this case, as a developer, the first time people are seeing my feature up against the main branch is at staging. And the scenario is incredibly frustrating, since if I'm giving feedback, I'm unable to implement that feedback, since the typical attitude is, well, like, let's deploy it now and fix it later. And I don't know when those changes are going to be added, or if I'll have time to reprioritize them. I'd much rather be able to implement that feedback now versus later, when it's fresh in my mind and I'm working on this feature. So last but not least, there's the frictions that we have, which is a great segue to containers. There's always frictions that we find between development environments to staging environments to production environments, and issues usually stem from these differences and not the code base itself. And that's where we have some flows in the process that are very time consuming. And we have to find why these issues are happening. And eventually we find out that these issues aren't about the code, but it's something to do with our environment variables and that we have in each environment. So to summarize, before I talk a little bit more about containers, the main issue here is that the code changes and the pull requests are being tested much more extensively for the very first time in staging and not earlier in the life cycle. Secondly, there's really no room for feedback in most cases. When product owners and customers communicate, there's that common joke of, you know, what the customer had in mind versus what the developer did and what the salesperson described. But if it's the first time everyone's seen it at staging, the mentality is typically, all right, let's push what we have. The next iteration, when you never know when that'll be, that's where the correction or the fix will be put in place. So finally, there's that friction between the environments. So here's a fun part. I'm sure a lot of you are working with containers and Docker. And containers, as I mentioned before, have fundamentally changed the way that we can do this as developers. It's reshaped the way that we build software, and it makes the operation part much, much easier for us. And it helps us rethink the way that we did things before. So I'll start with a very basic impact of containers on CI and CD in our pipelines, and then I'll get a little bit more complex. But the very first and basic thing that we can run is that we can run every step of our CI inside of a container. And as you know, when we work with containers, each time that we run a new container, it's a fresh new instance of that image. So we're almost completely eliminating the chances of new builds being impacted from any leftover previous builds. So you're isolating the builds and you're giving yourself a fresh container each time we rerun the build and compile the code. The second aspect is that the unit itself that we move from one stage to the other, that we hand off to operations or redeploy it into production, is a much more reliable and a self-contained unit. So when we know that our Docker image has passed our unit tests, our integration tests, our UI tests, maybe our security tests, so on and so forth, the likelihood that a Docker image to all of a sudden work completely different in production or staging, any kind of change is going to be much less frequent than any of the chances of just moving our code from one stage to another. And that's why Docker images are much more complete in the way to describe our application and to describe our code, because it's not only our code, it's everything else that we need to run with it. So zooming out a little bit from that Docker image itself, one of the strong drivers of images and containers is the adoption of microservices. So containers have been built from day one to support microservices, and it has all the ways we can define the linkages between them, whether we're using Docker Compose or Kubernetes or Mesos. All of these have slightly different ways of defining how that application's working. But in fact, containers allow us to define the application a lot easier with more than one container or a microservice, which ultimately allows us to essentially clone the staging environment much more easily. So we can create a staging-like environment much more simply. So the reason that I'm saying staging-like environment versus staging environment is because we have a rule that our staging environment has to be as identical as possible to what we have in production. And that's because there's certain things that we want to use the staging environment for. For example, let's say I'm running a retail website and I want to make sure that on Black Friday, I can support 100,000 concurrent users. So I'm going to build a staging server that's scalable as our production environment. And I can test on that staging environment to make sure that it matches up. But for other testing types like UI tests or integration, we don't necessarily need the scalability of what we have in production. We just need to have all the pieces of the application so we can work and we can test our features. So microservices allow us to clone much earlier in the cycle with a staging-like environment. And with that staging-like environment, reiterating what I mentioned before, all those frustrations about not being able to implement the feedback that I'm given, if I'm able to implement that feedback much earlier, I can actually implement it then. So that way, when it comes to staging, my feature works how I intended it to. There's nothing holding me back from implementing them, and by having this a lot earlier in the process, I can share that environment with customers, I can share it with product owners, I can share it with stakeholders, and I can also start running a much broader set of tests, similar to the one that I'm using in my staging environment. So you may be asking, well, we can't really have an environment that's exactly like the staging environment. How do I test my performance much earlier? So the typical way that we do this and with our customers at CodeFresh is that you'll test for SLA that you have for your application in your staging environment, since that's an environment that's pretty much needs to be identical to what you have in production and allows you to test your SLA. But you can also run your tests much earlier in the life cycle on a less scalable environment. And this allows you to track the trends. So if you test your performance earlier and you see over time that maybe the performance is slowing down and not going up, that can be a way to trigger a reason to go back and visit what you did and tackle it a lot earlier in your life cycle. So if we go back and we look at this staging environment and see all the sets of tests that we did for the first time at staging, we see that all of these can be shifted over to the left. There's no reason for us to stick to the way that we've implemented CI and have the staging environment be the very first time we're testing our code on these things. The more we shift these to the left, the faster we can identify the issues, the less bottlenecks we have in production, the more streamlined our pipeline is, and the faster we can push our code changes to production. So, last but not least, when we look at our Docker image here, it's a great revised way of looking at what our deliverables are. We're handing off our Docker image, and it's much more self-contained. And if an issue is found in a Docker image versus, say, a branch, if I rerun the same image with all the other microservices, it's much easier to reproduce it and tackle it. So this is the same Git flow from before. We have the feature branch, we have master, we have staging. But if we're working on a feature branch, there's nothing that holds us from provisioning a node and then just doing that in an automated fashion with Docker Compose up or other great open source projects that are out there. So if you're unfamiliar with Docker Compose, it's a way of zooming out from a single microservice and lets you define more than one microservice and volumes and networks that are all between them. So it's this abstract way of defining your application and allows you to get instances of your application much earlier and also on demand. So Docker Compose and Docker Swarm are great ways to scale your application. Kubernetes is another great way to run containers and to have different ways of describing your application. And a lot of these technologies allow you to describe your application running and make it a lot easier and allow you to earlier in the life cycle have a running environment of your feature branch with everything else around it. And with that, I can send a link to my team, I can get feedback, and I can incorporate it much earlier. And we can do this in an automatic way. So not only can a developer spin up a pre-staged environment and share it with the team, we can embed it into our continuous integration script, and we can spin that environment up, run our integration tests or our unit tests with other services, and then just shut down the environment. So we can simultaneously run integration tests, unit tests, other services, and we'll still have our last check at staging. But the likelihood of finding something like any kind of issue after running these tests much earlier is going to be much smaller since we've done these checks ahead of time. So next, since I mentioned that some Docker container technologies and orchestrations can do this, you can go and implement this yourself, and maybe you have, or you're currently working on it. And this can be implemented using, these technologies. You can use the scripts and provision the nodes of the Docker daemon or clusters on Kubernetes and monitor them. But I'm going to show you that when you build a product, how this can be implemented. You can kind of think of it as a kind of a top layer on top of all of this, and show you how you can set the pipeline, run the steps in the pipeline from the steps already given to you. And this will give you the ability to simultaneously run any sort of complex tests that you have and run them on every build and not just as part of the staging environment. So I am just going to switch screens here and show you how we do this in CodeFresh. So, and I'm hoping everyone can see my screen of CodeFresh. Please chime in if you can't. So I am gonna log in here as my demo account, and I logged in with GitHub. We also have GitLab, Bitbucket. We also offer on-prem as well. Just a moment here as we set up. Great, oops, we're having an issue logging in. Hold please, there we go. So I've created my account with GitHub. So the first thing I'm going to do is add my repository. And I'm just going to use a really simple chat application called Demo Chat. It's a Node.js application with a Mongo database. Let's see, maybe having a little bit of internet connectivity issues here. There we go. Great, so I'm going to click Next. So within CodeFresh, we have 3 ways of setting up our repository. We can use a CodeFresh YAML. This is going to be more of like a freestyle pipeline. We can use a template that's pretty straightforward. We just select a technology from this library. But I actually have a Docker file in my application, so I'm going to go ahead and select that and confirming the path to my Docker file. Here I'm just confirming that I have the correct Docker file. As most of you know, you can have more than one Docker file in a repo. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create and Build. So what's going on here is I'm building my Docker image for the very first time. The first time this will probably take a couple minutes, but the second time it's going to be a lot faster. And that's just the power of CodeFresh being Docker native. There's a lot of CI/CDs out there that have had to kind of move and adapt to Docker as it's a somewhat new technology, but we really built our product with Docker in mind and with containers in mind. So while this is building, I'll just give you a quick little tour here. We have all our pipelines live here in our repositories. Builds are going to be where any of my builds or any of my team's builds are showing up. It'll also show the status of my build, if it was successful, if I had a failure, so I can go in there and debug that. Images, this is where all of my images are going to live, as well as the metadata for all of those images. And we'll take a peek at this in just a second once we have one built. Compositions, so this is our way of connecting the dots between different pieces of our application. And this is what I was speaking about before. So in the case of this application, I have Mongo, which I need to run in parallel with my application to run those integration tests and to run those unit tests, but also to spin up a pre-staging environment. So by having that pre-staging environment, I can share that out to anyone on my team. I'll be given a link. I can send it to my PM. I can send it to my fellow engineers. I can send it to my manager. They can give me the okay, or they can give me the feedback. I can implement it much earlier in this process before it actually goes to staging. And then this environments tab, of course, is going to be where those environments live. So if I go back to my builds, so we are building the Docker image here. Looks like we're just about to be done. Great. So we also have a bunch of integrations. So I will go over to my user settings. Oops, sorry, my account settings. I can add a collaborator in here. Let's say I want to add Iran, if I can spell CodeFresh right. And I can add him in here. I have the ability to change his role as an admin versus a user. I can also delete him if I'd like to. And as far as integrations are concerned, we have Slack. So we have the ability to send build success and build failure and set up that integration so I don't have to keep checking CodeFresh. You can set up a registry of your choice. And we're also doing a Kubernetes beta right now. If you'd like to be involved in that, please email me at chloe@codefresh.io. I'd love to have you involved. Great, so this successfully built. So I'm gonna go over to compositions and make myself a composition. I'll name it demo chat just so it's easy to remember. And again, 3 options here. I can use a file from my repo, I can start from a template, or I can use an empty composition. I actually have a file in my repo, but I'll just show you an empty composition so you can see how that works. So I'm going to select my pipeline, and I need that to run on port 5000. So I'll just enter that in here. And you'll see while I'm adding all of this, it gets added on this right-hand side. And I also need to add Mongo, because that's the whole reason that we're creating this composition, is to be able to spin up this pre-staging environment. So I'll save this. And if I click over here to images, I can actually click the image that we built, and I get all of the metadata for that image. So everything from the SHA, the branch, the image size, tags, as well as the Docker file, the logs, and the layers. So I really have everything in one place. And this rocket icon here, which is not to be confused with deploy, I can actually run it as a standalone, or I can run it up against my composition that I just created. So I'm gonna select that. And so what this is doing is this is going to spin up that pre-staging environment that I was speaking to earlier. As I mentioned before, as an engineer, it's incredibly frustrating to get feedback so late in the process. In my former life, I used to be an actress. So the way that I like to think of it is having a rehearsal before going on stage before everyone. How am I supposed to implement any feedback that I get about my talk, or for that matter, implement any feedback on my code if I'm getting that information much later in the game. So this should finish up in just a moment here. So you can see up on top, we were initializing, now we are running Mongo. I really like the fact that I'm able to see everything that's going on inside of my container here. So this link that it just spit out, I can send that to anyone on my team. I can, oops, look like we're having an error. That's not fun. Well, what you would have seen is that this is going to spin up a pre-staging environment for us. And I can actually go into my images here. I'll load in just a sec. Great. Oh, sorry. Go into my position, and I can click my composition. There we go. So if I go into my environments, I can show more information. I can open up these containers, so I can see here that I'm running into an issue with my application, so I need to go in and fix that. And Mongo is running as well, which also makes it really simple to just go into my pipeline, and if I want to add any unit tests or integration tests, I can use a CodeFresh YAML, kind of do that freestyle pipeline. We have all the documentation for it here, where you can really customize your pipeline, or you can use our UI and spin up that composition that we just created up against our pipeline. So that is all for me for now. I will now take any questions. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. I can also shoot any questions that you have about CodeFresh itself to our engineers, or ready for anything.
Yeah, so guys, if you have questions, if you're shy, throw them into the chat. If you're not, feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself. You should be able to do that. If you have problems unmuting yourself, put a note in the chat and we'll figure it out.
And also feel free to email me if you'd rather take it offline. I know I can be kind of a shy participant in webinars, so I understand. Bueller.
Will the slides be posted?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share the slides with John, and we can have him share it out to the group for sure. Does CodeFresh work with GE? That is a great question that I can definitely get the answer to. Oh, GKE. So we actually are, I was thinking, oh, Butter, interesting. Yeah, we have a Kubernetes beta right now that we are working on, and if you'd like to be a part of that, shoot me over an email at chloe@codefresh.io, that's CHLOE, and we can definitely talk about getting you involved with that. It's been a really exciting project for us, and we're big Kubernetes fans, so yes, we do work with GKE. And if anyone's interested in on-prem, or maybe you have GitLab or Bitbucket, we offer support for all those things. We also, I'm sure you spotted it while we were looking at integrations, but we work with ECS, we work with Docker Registry. We also have our very own registry if you'd like everything contained in one place. And there's definitely ways to look up images based on commit IDs. Having all that metadata for images in our application is something that I think personally is really awesome, because usually I have to kind of scrape together different pieces. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned it in the write-up or in the abstract for the meetup, but if people want to play around with this, they can get access to a free CodeFresh account, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's 100% free to get started. You can just honestly, right after this webinar, log on today, try it out for yourself. And we offer everything, how to get access to a CodeFresh account. Just go to codefresh.io and you can get started. Totally free. And we also have, yeah. Sorry, I saw someone typing there. I got a little distracted.
Did you see that the question that's right above there? Have you moved all of the same steps from develop staging to feature branch develop?
Have we moved all of the same steps from develop? Yes, yeah. At CodeFresh, we actually run CodeFresh on CodeFresh. So we definitely do our testing much earlier. I think, am I answering the question correctly here? If you have anything to add there, happy to answer it. Alrighty. Yeah. And again, if you want to start on CodeFresh today, you get unlimited builds, unlimited repos, unlimited users. Totally free to start today.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Chloe. I mean, definitely a nice overview and review of you know, container-based development there, and certainly CodeFresh. I've played around with it. Is a pretty nifty tool. You could you know, use containers and use other tools to put a similar sort of flow together, but I think what CodeFresh is putting together does in fact simplify life. You know, if it maps to what you need, it is a really nice tool.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you can build it yourself, but my opinion is, since we have an expertise in this and we really know Docker users, we're happy to share the love and to have people use our product.
Actually, one question that I do have is there anything on the horizon in terms of supporting some of the other formats, such as Rocket, or LXC sort of functions differently? I don't know if that would really be a target for you guys, but Rocket would be of interest.
Yeah, I am not sure if that's in the pipeline, but I'll definitely run that by our engineers and get an answer for you.
Okay, cool, thanks. So if nobody else has questions, thanks again, Chloe. And yeah, hope we have you back here another time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you next time.